Winter pressed hard against the Nebraska plains in 1944. Frost clung to the fences, and the barbed wire glittered under a pale sun that never quite gave warmth. Inside the American prisoner of war camp, the loudspeaker crackled with the morning command. Tin trays rattled, boots scraped the frozen ground as a line of German women marched toward the mess hall, their breath rising like faint smoke in the cold air. The room smelled of damp wood and metal. Steam drifted from a large pot where American cooks stirred something pale and thick. Each woman received a scoop of the yellow paste, heavy and unfamiliar. One of them, tall, thin, her face hollowed by months of captivity, stared at the bowl and smirked. "Schweinefutter," she said. Her friend repeated it with a laugh. "Pig food again." The phrase rippled down the line. Laughter, short and bitter, filled the hall like clanging tin. They were used to black bread, potatoes, maybe cabbage if lucky, but this looked like feed for animals. Some prisoners mimed oinking sounds. The guard said nothing. The cook behind the counter simply kept stirring. Then the scent began to change. Somewhere behind the steam, a wooden spoon dipped into a block of golden butter. It melted slowly, releasing a rich, soft aroma that rose above the damp air. Salt followed. The smell spread quietly through the hall, and one by one, the women fell silent. They watched the butter swirl through the grits like sunlight breaking through fog. The laughter faded into the sound of spoons tapping metal trays. The one who had mocked first lifted her bowl again. She looked at it differently now. Not as slop, but as something that carried warmth. The guards continued their routine. The wind whistled outside the wire. But for a moment, the world inside the mess hall stood still. A single laugh of contempt, a drifting scent of butter, and the camp fell quiet. Something invisible had crossed the space between enemy and captor. Something simple, human, and disarming. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. History feels closer when we know we're hearing it together. In America, grits were born from hunger, not luxury. Ground corn simmered in iron pots fed the workers who laid railroads, the soldiers who trained at dawn, and the families who survived the Dust Bowl with nothing but patience and salt. To most Americans in the 1940s, it wasn't a delicacy, it was survival. Yet that same food, so ordinary in the South, powered an empire across oceans. By 1944, the United States produced nearly 85 million pounds of corn grits every month, enough to feed troops, factory workers, and prisoners of war from California to Georgia. The German women who stood in that Nebraska line couldn't have known. In their homeland, corn was for animals. Only potatoes and rye were fit for people. Cornmeal belonged to the poor, the forgotten. When they called it Schweinefutter, they spoke not just from arrogance, but from an upbringing that tied dignity to bread and hierarchy to diet. Food had always carried class, until they arrived in a country where class meant less than ingenuity. A German nurse named Liesel Hartmann, captured in Normandy, wrote in her diary 2 weeks after arrival, "They serve us corn porridge like for beasts, but no one is starving here. Even the lowest worker eats 3 times a day." The line was underlined in red by the camp censor before it was sent home. A quiet message meant to travel across the Atlantic. In the American South, soldiers grew up believing that strength came from making the most of little. Corn was their endurance in a bowl. It had no flag, no ideology, no pride, only purpose. One spoonful gave energy to build bridges, repair trucks, or load planes. It turned humility into power. When the prisoners first arrived, they saw the American mess hall as another front in the war. A place of humiliation, where even food could insult their identity. But as the days passed, something shifted. They watched how American cooks handled the grits. No rush, no disdain, only rhythm. A dash of salt, a lump of butter, a patient stir. It was the same care their mothers once gave to soup during hard winters in Bavaria. They began to notice that this nation, so vast and loud, was built on quiet resourcefulness. The women realized that the Americans had mastered something the Reich never could, turning poverty into strength. The thought unsettled them more than defeat itself. In the stillness of one gray morning, one of them whispered, "They won the war with this?" Her friend nodded toward the steaming pot and said, "Maybe they did." What one person mocks, another uses to feed victory. The morning began like countless others, but something subtle had changed in the air. The cooks moved slower, more deliberate. In the corner, the same southern woman who stirred every pot lifted a silver spoon and let a thick curl of butter slide into the grits. It hissed softly, melting like sunlight across snow. She added salt with 2 careful pinches, stirring until the yellow deepened and the smell filled the room. The German women, seated at long wooden tables, pretended not to watch. Hunger had made them sharper, and the scent reached straight through pride. One bowl was placed in front of Anna Keller, the woman who had laughed the loudest a week before. The steam rose up, blurring her eyes for a second. She hesitated, then dipped the spoon and took a cautious taste. The hall was silent. The guards at the door stopped talking. The sound of chewing was almost sacred. Then came the softest exhale, half sigh, half memory. No one laughed this time. The women looked at one another but said nothing. Butter shimmered along the surface, and for a brief moment, war no longer existed. Outside, trucks rumbled on frozen dirt roads carrying supplies toward another camp. Inside, there was only the clink of metal spoons and the warmth of food doing its quiet work. The cook, whose name they never learned, leaned against the counter. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened when she saw the bowls being emptied. Later, in her confiscated letter, Anna wrote one line that the censors decided to keep. "For the first time in months, I ate something that made me feel human." A corporal from Georgia later told another guard, "They ain't laughing now." His tone held no cruelty, just quiet understanding. Even he knew something real had happened, something that didn't belong to any army. That day, no propaganda changed hearts. No lecture about democracy was needed. A single spoon of warmth had done what speeches never could. Sometimes, in war, the smallest acts carry the greatest weight. A clean spoon, a drop of butter, a pause in the noise. Each can remind the defeated that they are still alive. By the time breakfast ended, the women sat a little longer, holding their empty bowls like relics of a feeling they couldn't name. Outside, the wind screamed against the barbed wire, but inside the camp, silence had turned gentle. In that silence, something invisible began to heal. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. Inside the wooden barracks, the women huddled close under rough army blankets, still thinking about the strange warmth from the morning meal. The taste of butter and salt lingered like a secret on their tongues. For Liesel Hartmann, it stirred something deeper. A memory of home she had buried under the noise of war. She remembered a small kitchen in Bavaria, the smell of corn porridge her mother used to cook before the harvest. They called it Maisbrei back then, simple, cheap, and golden. Liesel could almost hear the wooden spoon scraping against the pot, could almost see her mother's hand sprinkling salt the same way the American cook had done. A tear slid down her cheek before she even realized she was crying. The other prisoners were quiet. One of them whispered, "It tastes like home." The words hung in the dark like a prayer. Someone else nodded but didn't speak. The war had taken their houses, their husbands, their pride. Yet somehow, through a bowl of pig food, it had given back a piece of memory. Outside, the camp lights burned low, casting long bars of gold across the snow. In one corner, a guard was writing a letter to his wife, describing how the German women had stopped mocking breakfast. "Strange thing," he wrote. "They acted grateful, made me think of my mother's table back home. 2 kitchens, 2 nations, 1 war. And yet, in both, mothers stirred corn in silence, feeding hope from scarcity." In the days that followed, the women began to line up earlier for breakfast. No one mentioned Schweinefutter again. Some even tried to help with the kitchen chores, peeling potatoes or washing trays, just to stay near the warmth. They didn't have the words for what they felt, but they carried it like a fragile ember in their chest. One morning, Anna whispered to Liesel, "Do you think they meant to change us?" Liesel shook her head. "No," she said softly. "They just cook." And maybe that was what made it powerful. Not charity, not lesson, just care without condition. In the rhythm of stirring, in the smell of butter, in the sound of bowls being filled, they found something that had no side, no uniform, no anthem. Food had no enemy. It always found its way home. By January 1945, the Nebraska camp had fallen into a rhythm: reveille, roll call, work detail, meals. But in the small rituals of eating, something invisible had begun to change the prisoners' hearts. The women who once joked about pig food now waited quietly, bowls in hand, eyes following the pot of grits with a strange tenderness. Each scoop meant warmth, each bite a reminder that even in captivity, kindness existed. In the camp's censorship office, the guards began noticing a pattern. Letters home from the German women contained the same unexpected line, "They feed us well." Not lavishly, but well. One even wrote, "We eat cornmeal every morning. It is plain, but it comforts." These words carried across the Atlantic, cutting through propaganda, reaching families who believed their daughters were starving in American cruelty. A young translator named Private James Hollis from Louisiana often read those letters. He once showed one to the camp chaplain and said quietly, "They've stopped calling it pig food." The chaplain only nodded. "Sometimes," he said, "the Lord works through butter and salt." Each morning, the women began to speak of small things again: weather, children, recipes. The sharpness in their voices faded. Grits became their peace offering to the day. They still missed home, but their anger had softened into something almost like gratitude. Anna began keeping a small notebook hidden under her mattress. In it, she wrote, "Every spoon tastes less of war and more of mercy." No soldier could take that away. The camp guards noticed the difference too. Fewer arguments, less bitterness. Even the air around the mess hall felt calmer, as if some unspoken truce hovered between the bowls and trays. By then, rumors circulated that the war might soon end. Some of the women whispered about going home. Others stayed silent, unsure what home even meant anymore. One said, "Perhaps we will never eat this again." Another replied, "Maybe that's why we must remember the taste." What began as mockery had become memory, and so the story of a humble meal turned into something larger, the quiet diplomacy of hunger and warmth. Dear listener, have you ever judged a dish before tasting it? Have you ever laughed at something simple, only to find it carried a comfort you didn't expect? Sometimes the smallest things, a flavor, a smell, a shared bowl, hold the power to change how we see the world. By March 1945, the snows began to melt, leaving the camp paths muddy and soft. The morning air carried the scent of damp soil and wood smoke from the kitchen. The war in Europe was nearing its end, though none inside the wire knew for sure. Life in the Nebraska camp had shrunk to its simplest rhythm: work, letters, meals. Yet within that quiet pattern, humanity had found its voice again. That day, Anna Keller returned her empty tray and paused. The American cook, the same woman with tired eyes and strong arms, stood behind the counter wiping her hands. Anna hesitated, then said softly, "It was good." The words were awkward, her accent heavy, but honest. The cook looked up, surprised, and for a moment both women stared at each other through steam. Then the cook smiled. "You just needed butter." Anna smiled too, a real one this time, not the sharp, defensive smirk from the first day. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet something passed between them that no treaty could ever write down. Not surrender, not forgiveness, but recognition. Two women on opposite sides of history, connected by warmth from the same pot. Later, a guard found a small drawing left behind on a napkin, a bowl with steam rising, and beneath it, in careful handwriting, "Thank you." No one knew who had drawn it. They pinned it to the kitchen wall, where it stayed until the camp closed. Word spread quietly through the compound that morning. One of the prisoners had thanked an American cook. It was nothing in military reports, but everything in meaning. Even the guards seemed lighter that day, and for the first time in months, laughter returned. Not the bitter kind, but the sound of people remembering they were still human. Private Hollis, the translator, later told a friend, "They didn't need sermons or leaflets, just breakfast." Food had become a silent language of peace. No orders, no speeches, just butter melting over humility. When evening fell, the sky turned soft and pink above the wire. The camp was still guarded, still surrounded by fences, yet something invisible had shifted. The prisoners no longer looked at the Americans as symbols of defeat, but as people who, in some quiet way, had shared their table. No one could say when it began or who caused it, but in that kitchen, reconciliation had found its first breath. Tell me, viewer, do you think kindness can do what force never could? Do you believe peace sometimes begins with something as simple as a meal shared in silence? Summer 1946 arrived with the sound of trains. The war had ended more than a year ago, and one by one, the camps across America began closing. For the German women in Nebraska, it was time to return to a homeland they no longer recognized. The mess hall, once filled with laughter and shame, now stood half empty. Crates of supplies were being packed, fences mended for the last inspection. But each dawn, the cooks still stirred the same pot of grits, out of habit, out of decency, out of something like affection. On their final morning, the women lined up quietly. There was no mockery now, no pride left to defend. When the bowls were filled, the air smelled of butter again. The same warmth, the same gold shimmer across the surface. Anna Keller, now thinner, calmer, and older in spirit, took her spoon and whispered, "Pig food, no peace food." The others smiled faintly, understanding without translation. The cook, who had never known their names, noticed the way they ate, slowly, reverently, as if tasting memory. One woman broke a small piece of her bread and placed it on the table as if leaving an offering. No words were exchanged, only glances filled with quiet gratitude. Outside, the train whistle echoed across the plains. The women gathered their belongings. A blanket, a book, a folded photograph. But more than that, they carried something invisible. The realization that dignity could exist even behind wire. Before leaving, Liesl Hartmann approached the cook and said in halting English, "Thank you for not making us feel small." The woman simply nodded. "Safe travels," she said, voice steady, eyes bright. They shook hands, and for a moment there were no prisoners, no guards, only two mothers, two kitchens, two hearts remembering what it means to feed another person. As the train pulled away, the women looked through the dusty windows and saw the camp receding. The watchtowers, the kitchen chimney, the field where steam once rose from the morning pot. None of them would ever forget the taste of those grits. In post-war Germany, when bread was scarce and black markets ruled the streets, some of them tried to recreate it, mixing cornmeal and water on iron stoves, stirring slowly until the smell came close enough to bring tears. It was no longer pig food, it was the memory of compassion. And somewhere in that Nebraska kitchen, the old cook stirred another pot for new prisoners, unaware that she had changed the meaning of a single meal for women who once came as enemies. Years later, when the war had become only pages in history books, those small mornings in the Nebraska camp still lived on in the minds of the women who survived them. Anna Keller would tell her granddaughter about it, not as a story of hunger, but of awakening. How something as humble as grits taught her that defeat and dignity could share the same bowl. She would say that the taste of butter and salt reminded her that goodness does not always wear a uniform, that compassion sometimes speaks in the language of food. Liesl Hartmann, the nurse, never forgot the smell of the kitchen. In old age, she wrote in her diary, "I thought they were feeding us to keep us alive, but they were teaching us to feel alive." When she closed her eyes, she could still hear the sound of spoons against metal trays, could still see the fog of steam softening the faces of those who once mocked and now sat in quiet peace. Across the ocean, in America, the cook lived a quiet life after the war. She never knew that her small kindness had crossed continents, that prisoners once called her grits, food for peace. To her, she had only done what decency demanded, to feed whoever stood hungry before her. The story of the grits was never written in official reports, never recorded in any treaty. Yet it lingered, as all true things do, in memory, in warmth, in the scent of butter rising from a simple pot. War had divided nations, but a shared meal had proved something that weapons never could. That humanity, once remembered, is stronger than hate. In the end, forgiveness did not arrive through grand speeches or flags lowered at dusk. It arrived quietly one morning in 1944, carried on the steam of corn and butter. History often speaks of victories and losses, but rarely of breakfasts that healed. Perhaps that is where peace truly begins, in the small, unseen moments when someone chooses to feed rather than fear.